Good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here. Ooh, excuse me. My name is Jenna Moe. I am the Senior Director of the Aspen Society here at the Aspen Institute, and it's a pleasure to spend the evening with all of you. Thank you for making this your Monday evening. Special thanks to our members of the Aspen Society, the philanthropic community of the Aspen Institute, for helping make tonight possible, and also, of course, thanks to Soledad and Bob Hurst for underwriting the Hurst Lecture Series, and to Crystal Logan and the Aspen Community Programs team for their work this summer to produce a wonderful lineup of public events, and of course to their wonderful supporters as well. Our moderator tonight is Rachel Wolfe, a celebrated economics reporter at the Wall Street Journal, and our guest of honor, Kyla Scanlon, is a financial educator, creator, and author of In This Economy: How Money and Markets Really Work. Kyla will be doing a signing right after this talk, so be sure to check out her book in the lobby. And she was recently featured on the Ezra Klein Show and The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. So thank you both, and ladies, the stage is yours.
Thank you all so much. So the focus of our talk today is going to be really about young people in the economy, but I wanted to start off by asking you how the economy is right now. I had a story today that's like, actually, the economy is doing a little better than we thought, but still not great. And you famously coined the term vibe session, and a huge part of your work is about how the economy is not just markets and monetary policy, it's people. It's how we spend our money, it's identity. And so my first question to you is, in this economy, what is happening in this economy?
No, thank you all so much for having me. Aspen is so beautiful. I got to enjoy one of your trails today, and it was just gorgeous. So lovely town, and so happy to be here with you to talk about economics and specifically how it's impacting young people and how we can think about the economy moving forward. And so your question about the vibe session is this idea of a disconnect between data and sentiment. So oftentimes when we look at economic data, it feels like it doesn't always reflect the reality that we're living in. So metrics like GDP, gross domestic product, looking at different labor market metrics, maybe different inflation metrics, where you go to the grocery store and you're like, cereal's still really expensive. Like, inflation is it gone? Is it here? And that really impacts how people feel about the economy and how they move through the economy. And so over the past couple of months, there's been a lot of uncertainty, which you've covered very well in your reporting, and it's really changed how people are moving through the world. And so when you look at measures like consumer sentiment, we're seeing people be very worried. We're seeing people have concern about their jobs. Will they have a job in a couple of years? Will prices ultimately go down? Will I ever be able to afford a house? And I think that's kind of the big encompassing word for economics right now is uncertainty and navigating it.
So one of the groups of people that is the most susceptible to this uncertainty are young people who have not yet found their footing in the economy. And so we both write a lot about how young people are navigating this moment, this especially uncertain moment. And so I want to start off our conversation about young people by kind of defining our terms and laying out how what I think we both see as really these two distinct groups of young people doing. So we have, as you've described, people who graduated college before the pandemic and people who graduated after, and they're navigating two very different financial tracks right now. So can you lay that out for us a little bit?
Yeah, so I graduated college right into the pandemic, and so I was one of those people that got a job right before the world shut down, which I was very grateful for, because people like my brother that came after me had a much harder time getting a job. Like, I'm sure we all remember how difficult the pandemic was. Hiring was down. People were stuck at home because you couldn't go to work. And so it's really bifurcated young people in three segments, I think. So you have Gen Z 1.0, which is the term for, this generation. But you have Gen Z 1.0, so people who graduated right before the pandemic and they had a job, they were able to experience college without things like AI without Zoom classes. And then you have Gen Z 1.5, which is people like my little brother who had Zoom classes during college, who experienced this sort of weird loss of institutional trust because it's like, well, who actually does take care of us? And then you have Gen Z 2.0, so the people who are in college and high school right now, who are navigating this like very digital world and what that means for jobs. And, will AI replace entry-level work? And so this younger generation that we've been talking about is segmented into these three parts. And Rachel John-Sfaza first started talking about the segmentation of the generation, but I think this like three-pronged approach to understanding how young people move through the economy through the lens of digital tools is an important way to look at it.
Yeah, I graduated the year before the pandemic and had oh my gosh, do I have to go to an office 5 days a week for the rest of my life? Like, what is this? And before I had to fully adjust, they were like, nope, you have to go back to your parents' house for a second adolescence. And I was like, this is somehow better. And I never went back. Now I live permanently in New Orleans, which would not have been possible before the pandemic. So yeah, I just think that some of your work has been one of the first things that's really been written about how the pandemic has shaped our generation and how it's just totally changed the menu of choices that we have. And I think we'll get into all of that a little bit later. But okay, so we're talking about these 3 different segments of the young economy. How are these 3 segments doing? When we look, it's a complicated question. It's, when you ask, how's the economy doing? How are young people doing? There's not one great answer, but I'm often surprised by the answers that do exist. So for example, I was recently kind of heartened to learn that among 25 to 34-year-olds, so like young-ish, the labor force participation rate, which means like the number of people who actually have jobs, is around the highest it's ever been. So tell that to my dad, who's convinced that we're a generation of basement dwellers. I'm like, actually, we have a higher employment level than you did when you were younger. So my next question is, how are these different segments doing in the economy?
Yeah, I mean, you have people like that, like the older part of this generation who are able to get jobs. And then you have the younger part of the generation, as you've written about, who it's a tough hiring market right now. Like if anybody has young kids graduating from college, it's been historically quite difficult for them to get jobs. And part of that is due to AI displacement really having an impact on how people are thinking about entry-level work, and will we be able to automate all the jobs? And everyone's, trying to figure out what that means. And so I think the younger part of the generation is facing this labor market where it is a slow to hire, kind of slow to fire world. And that creates a sense of stagnancy. It creates a sense of discontent. And it's very challenging to get your foot on the first rung of that economic ladder if you're not even able to get that entry-level job.
So what does this mean in terms of whether or not young people want to work? I think there's always this idea in each new generation, there's always intergenerational tension. Now we're kind of seeing even millennials look down on the Zs, which is great. It's all this cycle of generations. But there is this perception, as there always is, but it feels especially relevant right now with the slow to hire, that young people are just lazy. They don't want to work. They are more focused on flexibility, on being able to move to New Orleans like me. So I'm a great example of this.
Yeah.
Do young people want to be working?
I think broadly, yes, right? Like I think most people find meaning within work. They find meaning outside of work as well, but work is important for establishing some parts of that. And I want to caveat the conversation with the idea that we're speaking in pretty broad brushstrokes. Every generation has had their own challenges, and we're speaking specifically to the very specific challenges of this generation, but that doesn't diminish the problems that came before this. They're just a different set of problems. And I think to your question about the things that young people are facing, Alex Tabarrok, who writes the blog Marginal Revolution and teaches at George Mason University, wrote this article recently talking about the Sputnik versus DeepSeek moment. And so when Sputnik happened, the Soviet Union, the space race, the United States responded to this threat with a lot of investment, a lot of we're going to go out there and train people, get jobs. And when DeepSeek happened recently, which is an AI model out of China, the United States responded with retrenchment, with tariffs, which is sort of turning inwards rather than thinking about how to invest in the population. And Alex pointed to a concept of zero-sum mindset as a driver behind that. So this idea that not everybody is going to be able to grow together. Only one person is going to be able to win. It's a very winner-take-all mindset that we're seeing in this economy with young people, with some of the policies being put forth right now. And so I think that goes into the kind of the question that you're asking is the psychology has shifted a bit, right? Like people are thinking about their prospects a bit differently. And Stephanie Stancheva over at Harvard has done a lot of great research on this at the Social Economics Lab out of Harvard, where people feel like they have to step on other people to get ahead. And this sort of rise of zero-sum mindset is it's new. And there's also a lack of upward mobility because of the housing crisis that I think we'll get into. But yeah, that's sort of the problem that we're facing is there's actually been a shift in psychology driven a bit by policy, but also driven a bit by how people feel like they can move through the economy.
How does this play out when you think about how young men and young women are doing in the economy? I've written a lot about the crisis of purpose facing young men, this idea that more and more young men feel like they are going to do worse than their fathers and their grandfathers, whereas a lot of young women in a great way feel the opposite, that they are on track to do better. We're seeing this play out in education rates. We're seeing this play out in our elections as young men and young women move further apart. You've even written about how it impacts people's dating lives, where it's gotten a little bit tougher to find a match if you're looking for like-minded, like-educated. But I'm curious what you think is happening with men and women's economic prospects and their financial futures.
Yeah, so I read a lot, so I'm going to cite a lot of papers because I think that helps, like establish evidence, establish credibility. But John Byrne Murdoch over at the Financial Times actually did a really interesting recent analysis of this question between the divergence of young men and young women. And so in the 1990s, the top employer in the United States was manufacturing. So most jobs were manufacturing. The United States was a very output-oriented economy. But by 2024, the top employer in most US states is healthcare. And so when we look at the jobs that are available, they're largely in healthcare. And so young women are graduating from college, at higher rates than men, and they're primarily graduating into these healthcare fields. And so that's creating a divergence between men and women too, because of the perception of care work. He gets into it very well in his piece about the nuances of the argument. But we are seeing young women have more success because their jobs are AI resilient, largely, that they're going into, and sectorally good because the United States has become increasingly a healthcare-oriented economy, a maintenance economy, rather than an output-driven economy.
Where does this idea of Gen Z as a Toolbelt generation fit in? So one of my colleagues has written a lot about how among young people there is a resurgence of interest in the skilled trades. It's actually the case that you can make six-figure salaries. You could do a lot better than just an office job that is now under great threat of being replaced by AI in the skilled trades. We're also seeing perhaps inadequate training. I'm curious if that stands to change young people. I think perhaps there's more interest among young men, but not exclusively. But how do you think that will continue to shape young people's economic prospects?
Yeah, so this is more an anecdotally driven observation, but I've been on book tour for the past year, and so I've been in a lot of US cities, and I've been to a lot of universities and have asked people, how do you think about your economic prospects? And I'm from Kentucky, and so I got to go home to my alma mater, Western Kentucky University, and I spoke to a student who was leaving that college to go work in the trades because he was like, I don't feel like college is a predictable path to me. I don't think I'm going to have a high return on investment. And I think, as your colleague wrote in that great piece, a lot of people are turning to the trades to get a more stable career path. And so the way that it appears is that there's almost two ends of the distribution. You have this embrace of Toolbelt pragmatism, which is great. It's a very important part of the economy, and it's something that we should invest a lot of money in, training people up for. But then you also have the other side of the distribution, where you have people investing in meme coins, investing in crypto. Some aspects of crypto are a little bit more volatile than others. You have people, doing sports gambling and things like that, and they're trying to do those things as a career. And that's maybe, neither good or bad, I'm not sure. But that's the approach, is people are willing to take on either a bunch of risk, or they're trying to reduce as much risk as possible by going into the trades.
How has technology shaped people's decision-making about their careers, but also just their economic prospects in general and their lives? This is obviously a generation that has come of age with smartphones, that doesn't really remember a time before social media. How is that playing out in all of these different aspects we're talking about here?
Yeah, I'm sure everybody in the audience probably feels the impact that technology is having on us. AI is a very interesting new development that we're all having to reckon with in one way or another. Social media, the comparison aspect of that, how people get a lot of their news from social media, and what that means for democracy. And so I think it's really impacting how everybody moves through the economy, because technology has become such a big part of the economy, and it's become a big part of how we think about the future of work. Like, will these entry-level jobs that are so important for young people to get into the career force, are those going to be automated away? What do we do if they are? Are we going to continue to have sort of these really fiery debates on social media that can polarize people more? And so I think it's like both from a perspective of the labor force with technology, but then also the perspective of a cohesive society where there's a lot more questions than answers.
Let's talk more about the belief in a cohesive society, and it's kind of vibe session-y, but it feels bigger than that. It's connected to Mondami being elected a couple of weeks ago, or becoming the Democratic candidate, rather, a couple of weeks ago, and we're really seeing just this total rejection of the status quo, I think, in a way that we haven't really. The election of Trump was a really big part of this. You wrote so eloquently about people chose Trump because of the economy. Saw a very similar thing happen in New York, and I really want to hear your take on just like the pessimism that's coming out of consumers right now. We've talked about consumer sentiment being really, really low, but both for the electorate broadly, for young people in particular, do you think that this is a time of less faith in the future, less faith in the way that things have always worked, and how are we seeing that play out?
Yeah, again, this is like a audience. I'm sure you might be feeling some of this too. It does feel like there's a bit of a pressure cooker going on. And so the Mamdani winning the mayoral primary, the Democratic mayoral primary in New York, was very interesting because he ran on a message of affordability with various policies that he says that will help affordability. And it was a very social media first campaign where everyone was watching his videos on social media, and that's how he got all that traction. And it was the first time that we've seen a Democrat really follow the same playbook as Trump. Like, Trump is a very social media first president, makes all his policy announcements on Truth Social, and it's just a different way of interacting with politics. And so I think people are going to they're trying to find solutions, because I think, you just talk to some people and there's a clear dissatisfaction with the cost of housing, with the cost of elder care, with the cost of child care, with the cost of education, with the cost of everything. And so they're like, clearly something has to change. What sort of policies are being put forward to change those things? Both Trump and Mamdani had their own solutions. And that is what people are trying to find, because it does feel, as you said, that the status quo isn't sticking. And so you see people go to the extreme ends to try and find that solution.
You've written a lot about the attention economy. You referenced it with Mamdani and Trump, but you have also said that the economy right now is being driven in large part by what brands, what politicians, what products are grabbing people's attention, and how being viral is an economic driver in and of itself. This idea that whoever has people's attention gets ahead. And that's so different from how things the attention economy has always existed in some capacity, but never like this. So how is the attention economy driving the economy more broadly?
Yeah, I mean, the attention economy is very interesting. And so this is the idea that social media kind of becomes a reality to a certain extent, as we saw with Trump and Mamdani and their elections. And part of my job is creating social media videos. So I make videos about economics on TikTok and Instagram, and used to do YouTube. And it has been very interesting because I've been doing that for the past 4 years. And so I've been sort of studying the system as somebody participating in the system. And I've been noting how attention has really taken over. And so it used to be that attention was a byproduct of power. Like once you gain power, people are going to pay attention to you. They're going to listen to what you say. But increasingly, it's becoming a precursor to power. So you have to get attention first, and then you're able to do whatever you want. And this is, again, broad brushstrokes, not a lot of nuance on stage here. But that is just a very interesting change, and it creates all sorts of misaligned incentives, right? Because the more that you can gather people's attention, the better off, theoretically, you'll be. And so has anyone heard of Jake Paul in the audience? A couple of people? Yeah. So he is a YouTuber who is very well known for his stunts, his virality, a little bit of nihilism baked in there. And I think you see more and more people kind of following this Jake Paul playbook to get attention. You see this with a lot of startups that are trying to get a bit of venture capital funding. It's like, we have to be video first now, we have to get attention first, and then A16Z or whomever will invest in us. It's just very different. One thing I'm also really fascinated by is the digital world versus the physical world. And so if you're in the physical world all the time, it's kind of like, oh, the digital world isn't real. But increasingly, the two are becoming one and the same because of what has happened with politics over the past election cycle. And I don't know, it's just, again, more questions than answers, which isn't great to say on stage either. But it's so fascinating because it creates, again, these misaligned incentives where you have to ask, are people's best interests being served by purely capturing attention? I'm not sure.
Yeah, and it reminds me, too, of, in some ways, economic sentiment, how people feel about the economy. Is the economy? We create the economy that we see in a lot of ways. If we see an economy that's going downhill, we spend less, and it goes even more downhill. Same thing on the other end. But you just wrote about how the attention economy and the connection between the attention economy and how Trump announced the Iran nuclear deal, the bombing. Connect that for me. The way that Trump has been announcing his policies in a way that's created to drive attention, and this is perhaps even impacting our national politics.
Yeah, I mean, attention is definitely what people focus on in terms of getting policy messaging across. Trump, as I said earlier, makes a lot of his policy announcements on Truth Social,
like the Iran,
including the announcement about bombing. And it just is different because it does give, for Trump, he owns Truth Social, so it's a bit different. But it gives a lot of power to the platforms. And it creates this weird situation where the platforms are able to monetize the discontent that might be created from gathering all that attention. And you don't have these sort of like neutral platforms that disseminate this information anymore. Instead, you do have algorithmically driven platforms, to repeat the word, that, again, it becomes a bit difficult to parse out what's true and what isn't in that world.
So let's go back to the economic pessimism that young people in particular are feeling and how this is connected to homeownership. So I live in New Orleans, which historically not such a great place to own a home. My partner and I would really love to buy a house. We plan to stay there. It seems like all the ingredients would be right. It's a much more affordable housing market than Brooklyn, where I was living previously. And yet the math is not necessarily mathing. It doesn't makes sense to pursue homeownership to the same extent that it once did. We don't have the same certainty that we're actually going to see a return on our investment at all. In many cases, it may actually end up being a losing battle with interest rates, insurance, and just the fact that it takes so much longer now for owning versus renting to be worthwhile. I'm curious how that is affecting young people's perception of the economy writ large, and then we'll also get into how that's tied to some of the other kind of missed milestones that's happening with young people.
Yeah, so there's a great paper from Works in Progress called The Housing Theory of Everything, and it gets into this idea that if housing isn't established in your life, it becomes very difficult to meet the other rungs on a ladder, right? On that economic ladder that we're all trying to climb up. It becomes difficult to get married. It becomes difficult to have kids, because the way that people interact with housing is that is what their foundation is. If that's not stable, it's difficult for the other parts to become stable. And I don't think it's any secret, I'd imagine, to most people in this room that homes are incredibly expensive, especially here. And when you look elsewhere, it feels very out of reach. And as you pointed out with interest rates, insurance has gone up quite a bit. Home insurance is a very big problem, especially when we, face some increase in natural disasters. It just becomes very far away. And so all sorts of life milestones, as Works in Progress documents in this paper about housing theory of everything, becomes delayed. And so you get a whole economic cycle that becomes delayed. People delay these key parts of their lives, and then we end up getting all sorts of downstream effects from that. Like the fertility rate is far below the replacement rate. We have an aging population. By 2030, 20% of the US population is going to be over the age of 65, and the demographics just aren't lining up, right, for us to maintain that. And it becomes more and more difficult for homes to be built. The Abundance Agenda by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson talks a lot about how we can build more homes through zoning reform, through elements of deregulation, through just thinking about how to build upwards as well. And so there are a lot of solutions to the problems that we've been lamenting on stage today, but it just comes down to policy and getting these things done. But homes are the key to people's economic future.
Yeah, I want to talk about the birth rate in particular. So this is something that I write a ton about. I'm super fascinated by, largely because it can be such a polarizing topic, and there's so much nuance there. So I was tasked a couple of months ago with writing a story about why people are having fewer kids, why instead of having 3 kids, families are deciding to have 2 kids. But as I got further in my reporting, I found that actually that isn't really happening. There aren't that many families that are having 4 instead of 5 or 1 instead of 2. Family size has been fairly consistent. What's driving the birth rate down is the fact that so many more people are having 0 kids. And we're seeing this, what I said in the story is that for a long time with millennials, it was later. We know that they were buying houses later, they were having kids later, they were getting married later. But what I think we're starting to see with Gen Z and younger millennials is that people aren't doing these things at all. And so the share of women who, elected women over 35, who had 0 kids has just really been rising quite dramatically in recent years, and seems to be continuing that way. And the other thing that I found that was really interesting is a lot of this is due to choice. So when the birth rate was lower around the Great Recession, that was largely because people felt like they couldn't afford to have kids, and then the birth rate went back up. What we're seeing now is that it's not that people feel like they can't afford it, it's that the sacrifice isn't worth what they think they'll get out of it. It's that they're just making a different set of priority choices than people did a decade or a generation ago. And so I'm curious, in your book tour and talking to young people, what you've been hearing, and also what this means for the economy if we have a generation of people who, it's not like none of us are having kids, but the set of priorities has become really different. It's more of a choice. Now it's more optional rather than just the thing you do.
Yeah, I mean, this is a global phenomenon, right? South Korea has, I think, been a leading indicator here, where the birth rate has declined or substantially, the marriage rate has declined substantially. And so I think all countries are kind of figuring out, how do you incentivize people to have children?
Can you?
How'd you say?
Can you incentivize people?
Well, yeah, I mean, South Korea tried paying people, and that didn't really work. And so it really becomes an infrastructure question. So in the U.S., childcare is quite expensive. One of my best friends just had a child and was telling me about how expensive childcare has become. And that's an important thing to invest in if we want to think about how do we sort of bring the economy to supporting young kids again. Childcare is a key part of that, and there's all sorts of other policy solutions that people have floated that I'm sure you all have heard before, like paid maternity leave, things like that, paternal leave as well. And it comes down to the priorities of a country and figuring out how do you incentivize people to do this thing that is quite, it's a big thing to take on, and it becomes about infrastructure and making sure that you're supporting the families that are trying to do this. And I'm sure all of you know this as well, but, we are much more separated than we used to be. Like there used to be generations living in the same home. I think that made having families a bit easier. And so it just becomes about adaptation. And a big part of that, again, is infrastructure.
There's some debate in the fertility community about whether or not you can get people to have more kids by paying them or creating the environment to do so. And kind of where I've landed is you can do it, but it's quite expensive, but it's also a pretty good use of money, because as far as the different things, the suite of things that a government can spend its money on, it has a really high rate of return because you're creating future taxpayers. But where do you come out on does it actually work to try to motivate people to have more kids, and would that work for young people today who are maybe not having kids because it's not only that it's more expensive, but that the expectations are so much higher, that there is less support in certain ways, and that people just have other choices. Women's labor force participation is way higher. Some people are just choosing their careers and their friends and their pets and their partners instead. They're picking from this basket of options rather than just doing it.
Do you think it's possible
to motivate people to have kids by paying them to do so? I think you've written about friction, and I think that it's tied to that. I think that you can make a lot less friction, but I think that there is a lot that's happening in the economy right now that doesn't help, and that just giving people a few $1,000s or even giving people more subsidized childcare wouldn't fix. I hear a lot in my reporting about people's environmental fears. I know that's something that's very important to Colorado and Aspen. I hear a lot of environmental nihilism when we're talking about this subject, and a lot of fear that people are bringing kids into a world that's just not going to be as habitable as it was during our childhoods. And I think that possibility is really hard to ignore for people, and that it becomes this moral question that previous generations didn't have. Like, is it a social good to have kids? I think it used to just be an unequivocal yes, and I think now I'm talking to people who have more pause. So I think it's possible. I think that quality of life improvements more generally, focusing on things like the environment, child care, I think would really help, but I don't necessarily know that it's a one-to-one correlation. Yeah. And I think when we look at issues with dating and marriage, I think we should talk about next, that there's a big increase in single parents by choice, single mothers by choice in particular, but not enough to offset the declines elsewhere.
Yeah. And so you've written a lot about marriage. I'm reverse interviewing you. So you've written you've written a lot about marriage. And so do you think that people are just opting to not marry either? And so when you look at what's going on with people having children or choosing not to, do you think it's just that people are thinking about their life paths much differently than previous generations?
Yeah, I think that's a lot of what's happening. And I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing inherently. And so this is something that I love to maybe not argue with, but talk with people of all ages about, because I think that there is a lot of fear that comes with not following the house, spouse, and kids by age 35 thing. Like there's a lot of friction to choosing a different path, but I don't think that it's creating a worse society. I think it's creating a different society, and perhaps a better, freer one in which the people who have kids really, really want to have kids, and the people who get married do it because they really, really love their spouse. That's part of why we're seeing the divorce rate go down, is because people are getting married less and more because they really want to be with that person forever. Probably have kids with them is a big part of it. I think the housing thing is where things are a little different. I don't think that that's as much of a choice, and I think that that, as we've talked about, is sort of impacting the other two. But I think there's a big change happening among young people, and I think that we're still seeing how that is playing out. But I don't know if that means that we're going to end up less happy than people who are older than us. What do you think?
I mean, I think that, so my mentor, Tyler Cowan, he writes on the Marginal Revolution blog as well, and teaches at George Mason University. He's an excellent, excellent economist. And one thing that he said to me when we were talking the other day on a podcast was that this is the most tumultuous time that he's ever lived through. And he's in his 60s. And I think that when I heard him say that, it cemented a lot of things for me. Because when you look at like the dot-com bubble or the great financial crisis, or even what happened in the 1980s, right, and all the things that happened 1970s and 1980s, like things were tumultuous then too. And so it's difficult to sit on stage and be like, things are hard right now. But I think that there is so much change, and there is so much technological change, there's so much societal change, and it's largely because that path of predictable progress, so go to college, get a house, get a spouse, have children, it's a bit different than how it used to be. And I think there is this sense of tumultuousness, if that's a real word, around that. And I think everybody's trying to process that change, and they're doing it through all different mediums, sometimes yelling at each other on social media, sometimes yelling at each other on airplanes, sometimes not yelling at each other at all and having, nice conversations like this. And I think when there is a time of immense change that is very fast rather than at a glacial pace, it can feel very scary. And I don't know if we'll boomerang right back into things being, go to college, get a house, get a spouse, have kids.
What do you think?
I think the pendulum always swings back.
Yeah.
That's just how life works. I've gathered from reading. But I don't know. I think the next couple of years, everyone's trying to figure out what technology means and how do we live alongside technology in both the digital and the physical world. And it brings up a lot of questions about quality of life. What is happiness? How do you measure happiness? I don't think anybody's really come to that answer. And so that's not quite an answer, but
as much of one as I have, which is not one at all, which is why we love talking to people about these topics so much. It's just so fun to hear what other people's answers are. If people aren't following the path of predictable progress, what do you think they're doing instead? That's a big question that I've been trying to answer recently, and something that I think my answer on is still evolving. I think that people are doing lots of different things instead, and that's great. But I'm curious if you're seeing any patterns emerging.
So one thing that the digital world enables is the fragmentation of self. And so a lot of people are able to explore hobbies online, explore conversation online, explore interest online that they might not have been able to previously. And so I think people are spending a lot more time on those sorts of mediums. But then I think also, as you hinted at, like there's more hobbies, and then a lot of people are going that more predictable route too. So it just depends mostly. Yeah.
Yeah, as we get to the end of our time before the Q&A, I want everybody thinking about your questions for Kyla. I want you to do a little bit of future casting. I know economists or economic commentators hate this, but we've been talking about young people. Every young person turns into an old person. I have a theory that some of this volatility right now, and some of the, maybe it's a delay, maybe it's a never, some of the things that we're not doing, since it's being coupled with, for the older young people in particular, people still have jobs, people's wages are keeping up. I think we're actually going to be okay financially. That's, I know, a very revolutionary thought, but that's kind of my pet theory. I don't know that I would publish that in the Wall Street Journal, but it's what I truly believe, that I think we will be okay when we're old, like everybody turns out to be. But where do you think we land in this economy?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because when you look at the present generation who is starting to retire, 43% of boomers don't have any retirement savings at all. And so there is this wealth inequality that we have to grapple with and figure out, because when you think about things like Social Security and funding that, it does depend on more and more people entering the labor force, whether that be through immigration or through people having children. And so I think that structurally, what it looks like to be a retiree is just, it's a question that we're not really sure how to answer. Like, do we raise the retirement age? How do we think about helping people through retirement? How do we make sure that elder care isn't very expensive? We had to put my grandma in an elder care home, and it was $10,000 a month, which was a lot of money for my family. And that sort of stuff isn't sustainable. And I think when we look at a population that is aging, we have to think how to take care of that population and make sure that, the young people are okay, that middle-aged people are okay, older people are okay. There's so many parts to the economy that deserve a lot of attention and a lot of policy work and a lot more investment than we've given it previously. And I think that's just going to be the big question is, how do we think about investing a bit more in infrastructure so our young people can retire, and our people who are trying to retire right now can as well.
Yeah, this reminds me of the writing you've done on the Great Wealth Transfer, too, where we have this segmentation among boomers as well, where there are a lot of boomers who have quite a lot of money and who will pass that money on, who we're already seeing doing that, giving while living. What effect is that having on young people, on the economy writ large?
Yeah, so there's going to be about $84 trillion transferred over the next...
Just a little bit.
Yeah, quite a bit of money.
Yeah.
Quite a bit of homes, too, which might help with the housing crisis that we were talking about. But it's just going to be interesting. What do the younger generations do with that money? How does it get passed down? I've done a bit of work on this wealth transfer, and it's like I believe it's 1/3 of people who are planning to transfer their wealth have not talked to their children about the wealth transfer and like what's going to happen with that. And it goes back, there's again a lot in that, but it is going to create a new set of people who are going to have a lot of capital. And based on the surveys that these people have taken, they're very interested in environmental causes. They're very interested in philanthropy. And so maybe that's, where we get some infrastructure. I'm not sure. Yeah, it's going to be a lot of money changing hands. Yeah.
What advice do you have for young people who are navigating the economy right now?
I mean, as we've sort of talked about for the last 45 minutes, the economy is quite difficult to navigate, and it is very fragmented, and everybody has a very different experience of it. Everybody has their own inflation rate, everybody has their own interaction with the labor market, with the housing market, with elder care, child care, et cetera. And so the economy is extraordinarily personal. And the way that we oftentimes talk about it as if it's not, right? Like we've been up here kind of generalizing this entire 45 minutes, which is hard to do because the economy deserves so much more nuance, but it's difficult to get into in just 45 minutes. And so my advice to that would be the economy is personal. And you have to sort of do what you can with whatever skill set that you have. There's been a lot of encouragement for young people to think about, training up in the trades or training up in sort of AI resilient fields so they're a bit protected from the technological change that is happening. To save money, high yield savings accounts are really great, especially right now with interest rates.
Yeah. You can't buy houses, but
but you can have a high yield savings account. And so I think it's just really like thinking about saving, investing, thinking about the skills that you have for the job that you want, and then just having an economic map and a financial map for your future as best you can.
What does an economic map and a financial map what does yours look like?
Well, mine is it's really about saving money right now, and it's about investing. So for me, a house is a bit uncertain because I don't know where I want to live, and I am using high yield savings account. I toss $50 every month into the S&P 500, not investment advice, but it's what I do. And I just try to do what I can to take advantage of compound interest. You know, as they say, time in the market is better than timing the market, and I am no smarter than the average investor, and so I don't try to be. I just try to take advantage of the different ways that you can invest and save. Yeah.
Sounds like great advice to me.
Not advice, but...
Well, okay, sorry. Sounds like great not advice to me.
Advice.
Other people's advice that you've just taken. Okay, I think if it's okay, we're going to open up the field to a broader Q&A. First, in the back there.
Austin spent last year $1 billion to house immigrants in hotels with Uber and Visa. I pose this question to you young people. Is there a way that young people from the bottom up or the top down don't have to wait for the midterm election, but where mayors are encouraged with governors to find out who needs a farm worker, who needs an elderly person, who needs a person to help with an elderly person, your mother, in her home or in a facility, who needs child care, who would want to live with the family the way it was done years ago, or who would be willing to work at child care places. Is there a way that you young people can try to connect to MAGA young people or older people, or to try to bring some creative ideas together? Thanks.
Yeah, so your question is about how do we think about training up people to prepare for these jobs across the political aisle?
Help people fill the jobs that we're going to need in a year or so. Mm-hmm. They say that, profits, without immigrants, the profits may go down and the economy may suffer. So I'm wondering if there's not a creative way to try to hit a lot of issues.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if I understand your question correctly, the way that we can think about these jobs that are going to need some sort of, person filling them is investing in training, investing, again, in the infrastructure around these jobs. That's been one part that has been a bit missing from recent policy proposals at the federal level, is training in these jobs that are so necessary. And so it does come down to the local economies and mayors and governors investing in these careers for people. And some states have definitely taken that initiative and have thought about, how do we train up the next generation of electricians? How do we train up the next generation of care workers? And so it does, I think, become really important for local politics to take the role when we're maybe not seeing the impact at the federal level.
Black shirt.
You've talked a lot about policy and government roles and everything. You brought up an $84 trillion wealth transfer coming. This generation in this room has, through our electoral choices, brought on a $36 and growing $1 trillion national debt. Do you think the 20 to 40-year-old demographic is interested in estate taxes being changed, and instead of you getting that check, that it goes to pay down the debt and to finance all of these policies that you'd like to see on training and everything?
What do you think?
Thanks, Kyla. I can't say I've seen any data on what how different generations feel about estate taxes. I do know from talking to young people that I think young people tend to be a little bit less concerned with the national debt than older Americans. Call it ignorance. I think it's an excellent thought question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, sometimes people answer surveys in a way that doesn't reflect to what they actually mean, revealed preferences, perhaps. And so you do see in some survey data that people are like, I will take on higher taxes, please tax me a bit more. And then when it becomes time for taxation to come forth,
what is this?
Yeah, I hate this and everything else. Something will have to be done about the national debt, especially with interest rates so high. The interest payment burden is just untenable. And I think there's something to be said about productive debt. So if we take out debt and we're investing, sorry that I keep on saying infrastructure, but if we're investing in infrastructure, if we're investing in things that pay us back, that's good. But if we're investing in things like tax cuts that don't necessarily pay us back, as we've seen with history, not just my opinion, it becomes difficult. And so I think that's the question that we're going to have to answer again, is that, people have a certain preference towards tax cuts, but it probably, we always say this and we've been saying it for decades, but it will become time for somebody to take responsibility for the financial mismanagement of some of the things that have been going on. I'm not sure who will have enough courage to do it, but it'll probably have to happen eventually, yeah.
So we'll probably be dealing with it one way or another. Okay. Down here. I'm just going to make you talk loudly.
Sure. You talked about infrastructure a bunch.
I have.
Top 1 or 2 things that we should put in money into infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, I really think these training facilities are super important. So how do we think about training up the next generation electricians? How do we think about training up, again, the next generation of care workers? And then I think the child care and elder care infrastructure deserves a lot of attention. So the sandwich generation is the Gen Xers, right, who are dealing with high child care costs as well as dealing with high elder care costs. And that is also something that's very difficult for people to manage, specifically in that generation. And so I think it really comes down to how can we train people up and how can we make sure that the future of our population is taken care of, and then the population that has done so much for us is also taken care of. Yeah.
I love that answer. Okay. In the plaid. Or gingham.
This plaid, yeah. Checkers.
Checkers.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Yeah.
Okay, for decades, the conservative voice has told us about the dangers of the spiraling national debt. You just mentioned that perhaps the reason it's not an exciting thing right now is because of ignorance among young people about what the effect of the spiraling national debt is. Mechanically, how does a spiraling debt, like the 10% increase that we had passed last week, what will affect, how mechanically will that increase affect the economy over the next decade? Is it decreased purchasing power of the dollar? Is it an increase in the deficit? Is it an increase in the balance? It's a disparity in the balance of trade. Is it an increase in interest rate? Mechanically, how does a spiraling national debt affect us?
Yeah. So I'm happy to have, you should jump into,
No,
but I think your point about the dollar is really key, because when other countries see a country mismanaging their debt, they're like, I don't really want to do trade with that country anymore. Argentina has gone through this. And the dollar, the currency, begins to not be so valuable. The other part about a spiraling national debt, to not get too deep into the weeds, is that it just becomes more difficult to take on new projects because there is a debt ceiling that we really keep pushing up every time we hit it, which is great. But there's a certain point where you just can't keep on financing all of these things, and the country doesn't have as much mobility to make the decisions about investing in infrastructure that they might have had to previously. And then you also have to think about how do you raise revenue to sort of manage the country, and that does come through things like raising taxes, which are politically quite unpopular. And so it just puts the country into a pickle of sorts where you can't really do what you want to. The dollar gets under pressure. People might look at treasuries and say, I'm not really interested in those either. It becomes harder to finance it that way. But is there anything that you would add on top of that?
I think by ignorance, I more meant when you're young, the future feels far away. And so I think when you're young, oftentimes there's a little bit more optimism about what the future might hold, even in this very volatile, precarious moment. And so I think that I think there's a lot that we don't really know. I think that, yes, it makes a lot of sense that at some point we're going to have to deal with this. And I also think that we've never seen this level of, we've never seen it before. And
especially not at wartime.
Exactly. Yeah. And so we actually don't really know. And I think that perhaps there is a bit of hiding from the inevitable in that, and perhaps we have more time than we think.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that we didn't really talk about is that the United States has been the kingmaker. Well,
right.
You know, it's a number one country. I shouldn't say king, but like number one country for a long time. And, you know, that might come under question. And so then people look at the debt load and they're like, whoa, why does that country think that they can just be so free and easy with their money? Like, we don't really trust them anymore. And so the United States I can't believe we didn't talk about this, but like the United States as itself is under a lot of pressure from countries like China, who are heavily investing in infrastructure, they're heavily investing in jobs, and they have their own problems, of course. But, you know, the national debt comes with this bow on top that says we are going to be, you know, the most stable country in the world, and you should invest with us, and it'll be great and perfect. And increasingly, people are like, well, maybe that's not true. Right. Other countries are looking for other trade partners. You know, we're tariffing people as well. And so, you know, the national debt is a privilege. A debt level as high as we have is a privilege. And if we're not able to be as privileged as we've been in the past, it will create a lot of problems. Yeah.
I love that answer. Middle, yes.
Thank you. And it is a privilege because we can print our own currency. But one of the things, if I can just go back to the beginning when you were talking about how you're kind of seeing the polls with either going into very traditional jobs or kind of gambling their way into like, you know, I give up kind of financing. As you travel around, like what glimmers of hope and what new strategies are you seeing in young people talking about money and finance? Because, you know, to just this gentleman's question, like what got us into this is not going to be what gets us out. And 15 years ago, maybe it was the FIRE movement. And, you know, there's different things that people were strategizing. What are you seeing today, and how are people talking about doing things differently?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Like, what is there to be hopeful for? I mean, I think there's a lot to be hopeful for. Like, you know, we talk about some aspects of investing, especially with things like, you know, gambling on stocks, perhaps. Like, I don't know if anybody's been following the Open Door saga, but there's this meme stock that's new and people are investing a bunch of money in it. And part of that is like, wow, people are investing a lot of money in this stock, but it's also like, oh, we've given people a lot of freedom to do what they can with their money and to take advantage of things like compound interest. Ideally, they wouldn't be gambling it on a meme stock, but like, that's something very interesting that we've been able to offer. Like, the democratization of finance has been very powerful for people to take financial matters into their own hands. So I think that's one thing that has been positive with some negative repercussions, but overall quite positive. And then I think people have also been able to have jobs that are a bit different than traditional career paths. Like, you know, my job is a bit strange, posting videos on social media and writing books and, you know, being able to travel and talk to a lot of people. Like, there are just so many new ways to make a career that you're able to strike out on your own. So there's a lot of autonomy that people are able to embrace, a lot of agency. And I think that's very hopeful and exciting too, is that people are able to take matters in their own hands. And it has, again, repercussions that are a bit concerning, but it's overall something I think that can be exciting. Would you have anything to add?
I think that people's relationship to work has changed a lot. I think that the pandemic really changed our relationship to work in a way that's looking permanent. And I think that people are putting a lot more value in finding meaning from their work, or just thinking about what does a job get you aside from just a salary. I think we're seeing that question, people asking themselves that question even more when it's not only a way to support a family too. Supporting a family is a bonus maybe sometime down the line, but people are really saying, okay, what can this job do for me? And I think that that can be a really great thing. I think that our superiors don't always love it. I hope my boss is watching this, so not you, Tammy. But I mean, for me, it's looked actually the opposite, like investing really heavily in my career because I don't have a house, a spouse, or kids. Like, my work is actually a huge part of my identity, even more so than I think it was for my parents, because I think I was able to choose a career that was a little bit riskier. Yeah. I was able to find a job that allowed me to live in a place that I find really fun and exciting, and I'm able to approach my work as a really big part of my life rather than just a job. And I think we're seeing more of that too, that it's not just that people are like, oh, you know, this job is just like something I have to do for money. People are really saying, okay, how do I want work to fit into my life? What is the role of money versus the other things I could be doing with my time? And I think that's really cool. I think we have more freedom now. I think we're out of time. Any closing thought?
No, thank you all so much. I hope this was informative.
Yeah.
Thank you. But I was trying to pour that, and I was I was like, whoa.
I have no idea how I was pacing myself with my water.
Yeah, well, you just had to turn it over, but
I'm just afraid of speaking into this.
I know.
Thank you.
I really appreciate your help.
Well, thanks a lot.
Are you
Thank you so much.
Have a great night. Yeah.
Are we good here?
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll appreciate your help. If you want to hang out, sign on. Otherwise, we're good.
Sounds good. Thanks, Art.
Appreciate it, man.